Christine Delphy has been both an activist and a theorist, and in that sense, both Uma and Christine are really women's studies personified. She worked with two women's groups in France and was involved in several feminist campaigns. As an academic, she worked at the National Centre for Scientific Research in Paris and did, and most credit would go to her, almost invented the term materialist feminism. With Simone de Beauvoir, she started a journal called, roughly translated, New Feminist Issues, and they were editing this together since in start of 1977, and she continues to edit and publish this the journal. It's interesting because we're talking history, perhaps in both the papers, but often what one does, or writes, etc., has influences, both good and bad, and that's perhaps what feminism always says: the personal is political, and you get in this dialectical relationship always. Christine was not aware of this until she came here, that she has actually played or figured in my own history rather detrimentally, because as I told her, I sort of blame her for my not having completed my PhD. Because at the time when I was doing my PhD, very much within a Marxist-Leninist framework on the peasant economy and on the peasant revolution, I did notice in my own empirical work that we were looking at the household of the unit of analysis, and there was a big gap in terms of not looking at women. And that's the time when Christine is actually developing and has developed and published for a theoretical construct which she's very well known for, which is the domestic mode of production. And that was in the 1980s, and I felt that my own thesis was therefore absolutely incorrect, because I thought she was more correct than what my thesis was saying. And I either had to go back and do it all over again, and didn't, because I came back to do it, and Women's Action Forum started, and all sorts of other things that then preoccupied me. We met again in 1996 in Brighton, and I was very keen to meet this woman who had so upset my apple cart. I was, however, delighted to meet her, and decided almost then that we must get her to Pakistan. We worked on it all of last year with His Excellency the Ambassador to France and two different people from the cultural section, and I'm very happy and very proud to present Professor Christine Delphy. I have not given the title of her paper, which is Gender and Class in Western Europe Today, the Case of France.
Well, I am very happy to be among you tonight. And I'm very grateful to Nihar Khan and to the Institute of Women's Studies, Lahore, to have managed to bring me over here. It's my first time in Pakistan. It is absolutely fascinating. I've already spent a week in Lahore and managed to see the sites, as well as giving a lecture and being present at a seminar at the Institute of Women's Studies. And I met several feminists from Pakistan, and this is all a very, very interesting, and more than that, more than interesting experience. So the topic that I would like to address today is gender and class in Europe today, the case of France. Now, why do I say in Europe today? It's because I think that structurally there are not many differences between the countries of Western Europe. And the differences are only in terms of degrees, but not in terms of the very structure of women's situation. So, at the same time, I will take the case of France because, of course, it's the case that I know the best. And what I will do is first talk about the economic situation of women. And this is mostly what I will talk about. Not that I think that the economic situation of women is in any sense the beginning and the end of women's oppression, but I do think that it is a very important part of it, and that it can be considered as a material basis for the other oppressions that women suffer. Of course, I must say where I start from, and in my view, I start with the holistic definition of gender, that is of women and men. And by holistic, what do I mean? I mean that these two categories cannot be conceived of independently of one another, but not in the traditional sense, you know, that men and women like go together like love and marriage, or like a horse and carriage, but in the sense that the dominant figure of man would not exist without the dominated figure of woman. And that therefore the situation of women cannot be conceived of as a lag. That is, women cannot be conceived as a sort of different population which would have just arrived on the scene, and some new kind of migrants or extraterrestrials, and who have not yet mastered the skills and who will one day catch up, which is usually how it is conceived of. Neither can the inequality between the sexes be conceived as the effect of women's so-called natural handicap, any more than the proletarian condition can be conceived of as a result of some biological inferiority of the members of the working classes. Although this was the idea of 19th century conservatives. They thought that the lower classes were biologically inferior to the upper classes, which in due course, of course, they became inferior after a life of toil. So, in general, in my work, I have decided to look for the origin of women's status, not in some remote past or some preconceived idea of the prehistoric past, which we do not know about and will never know about, and none of us has ever been there or will ever go there, in prehistory I mean, but in the material conditions that are imposed on women, and especially in the production of their own lives. Now, if I go to, first continue with that hypothesis that gender, which in my understanding of it, and I know that there are other definitions, and some definitions are criticized by feminists. For example, some of the international UN definitions are criticized by feminists, but my understanding of gender is that it is a constructed side of sex, or the understanding, this light is in my eyes again, by three different mechanisms at work. There is pure and simple underpayment of women on an hourly basis for the same work. There is vertical segregation, which means that in all branches of occupation, women will be confined to the lowest social professional category occupation. And then there's horizontal segregation. Horizontal segregation is the existence of branches where there are only women, or where they are the majority, and the whole branch is then underpaid. Now, all these gaps, all these three mechanisms, usually give that figure, which I've just given you, about a difference of 30% between men's wages and women's wages. But the actual difference in income is much greater, because like is not compared with like, in the sense that what is not taken into account is A, that lots of women do part-time work, and therefore do not work the same hours, and all these differences are calculated on the basis of an hourly wage, and B, that not all women work in a given time. So in also it's calculated on the basis of, it's calculated only for wage workers. But we have no information on the differences of income between professionals, for example, doctors, architects, etc., for men and women in the independent and liberal professions. And furthermore, what we do not know is the overall income differences by sex. And this, of course, must be affected by the fact that in France, again, 3 to 4 million women do not work for wages. Now, they may not be the same women throughout their lifetimes. They may be women who have worked or will work and have dropped out of the labor market for a time. But at any given moment, there are in France about 3 or 4 million women who are called housewives and have no income at all. Now, if we took that into account, the income differences between the two groups, that of women and that of men, would be much greater than what we make it out to be. Now, let's look at these housewives, because this is very crucial for the theory of the domestic mode of production, which Nigat has mentioned as being one of my sins. Many of these housewives, or so-called inactive women, work without pay. All of them work for consumption, for work in order to provide goods and services which will be consumed in the home. And by goods and services, I mean meals, iron shirts, clean babies, nice, etc., etc. All that which is called housework. They also work, so that means that they don't, their production does not reach the market and is consumed at home by their own families. Now, it's not the whole story, because a lot of them also work towards production of goods or services which are brought to the market by their husbands. There are the wives of independent workers, be they professional, like, for example, doctors or dentists, lawyers, architects, or craftsmen, like mechanics, plumbers, electricians, or farmers, for example. Typically, farmers use their wives' labor in the production of agricultural goods which are brought to the market, but which are not brought to the market by the wives themselves, but by their husband, who gets the income and controls that income. So the women have no rights on that income. Now, that kind of situation where the woman works either totally for consumption or partly for consumption and for the market, but which to me is one and the same thing, because that means that their work is totally appropriated by the husband, is what I have called the domestic mode of production, and defined as the economic basis of patriarchy. It declines in figures, and a mixed mode becomes predominant. Now, in this mixed mode, the women work outside and therefore gain a measure of independence. But when they are married to a man or living with one, this is at the cost of assuming a considerable workload, for they are not then exempted from their domestic responsibilities. They only have, according to the very detailed figures that we have in Europe, and especially in France, they only have a little fewer of them than the housewives who are in the pure DFB. In France right now, a working woman has 3 hours and a half of domestic work per day, and a housewife has 4 hours and a half. So the difference on a daily basis, but only of 1 hour. Thus, the independence that a man gains at the price of 8 hours of work per day, they must pay with 11 or 12 hours of work per day, And still, it is not quite the same independence. They are not paid as much on the labor market as we have just seen, and therefore they are more dependent on the earnings of their husband or concubine than he is on theirs. And this becomes very clear when the couples divorce. Now, what is the other choice? To be a housewife. They globally work less. They have less working hours during the day than the so-called active women. That is, the housewives work only 50 hours per week. But that is at the cost of total dependence. Thus, in the West today, I mean in Western Europe, patriarchal exploitation can be said to consist of a mixture of capitalist overexploitation that is taking place in the labor market, but according to patriarchal mechanisms, and of domestic exploitation. Domestic exploitation being characterized by personal dependence, that is dependence towards one person. Now, despite these structural conditions which make every choice a bad one, women for the past 15 years have been going out more and more on the labor market. And statistics show that women prefer to bear an increased exploitation in terms of work hours in order to gain a degree of financial autonomy. In the same way, statistics show that divorce statistics show that women very often prefer relative or absolute poverty to remaining prisoners of an unhappy marriage. So, however limited these choices may be, they nevertheless represent objectively, and for many women subjectively, an improvement on the total absence of choice faced by women without paid work. Now, I'll move on, having given this sort of picture of the structural conditions, move on to what's happened in the last 15 or to 20 years in France, and which is probably more specifically French, or at least it's more difficult for me to know to what extent it applies to other European countries, although I sort of have an intuition that it's probably very much the same. Now, the last 15 years have witnessed two opposite trends. So on the one hand, that influx of women on the labor market, which I have mentioned before, and on the other, an increase in the sex segmentation and even the general segmentation of the labor market. To summarize in a somewhat satirical way the recent trends, one could say that while women are more willing than ever to hold jobs, they will hold fewer and fewer of them, because alongside capitalist principles, patriarchal principles govern the labor market, with the result that today it is women first who pay the cost of the current crisis in employment in Western Europe. In France, the level of employment is about 12% of the active population, that is the population which is at work. And this deterioration of the relative situation of women on the labor market has two characteristic features. On the one hand, women are unemployed twice as often as men. And on the other hand, they hold virtually all the part-time jobs. That is, they make up 85% of the part-time workers. And whereas 15 years ago, all women who were working for wages had full-time jobs, now 25% to 30% of women in France, so it was a very quick evolution, have part-time jobs, and that whether they wanted it or not. So that's a quarter of the female workforce. Half of the female workforce in England is employed part-time, and in Sweden it is the same proportion. But on the other hand, in Sweden, 80% of the women have jobs. So the level of part-time working has to be always mitigated with the overall level of employment of women. So my hypothesis or my interpretation of it is that job flexibility was arrived at through a tacit agreement between employers and male workers. That is, rather than reducing working time for everybody or introducing flexibility in all the jobs, women are assigned to part-time work. But I may reassure you that the terrible things that are happening to women are now happening to men too, because flexibility is being introduced for everybody. So we have a kind of negative equality, unfortunately. One could say at the beginning this was oh, you'll never know the end of the story. Now, you see, these male workers usually have wives, most of them. And that makes them double winners. Because as men, they of course benefit from their own wife being less paid than themselves, because that means, you know, as men, they benefit from women being underpaid. But then, as married to a particular woman, they benefit also from her housework. Whereas the women undergo a kind of double jeopardy, because they bring home less money, even when they work full time. And this is used by their husbands or concubines as an argument for refusing to share in the housework. That means that women have no bargaining power, or little bargaining power, and they have no bargaining power at all when they work part-time, because then their financial contribution to the household diminishes, whereas on the other hand, the husband can always say that they have more free time in which to do the housework. So, what is the upshot of this? And I'm not going to, I'll try and end earlier than I thought. It gives us a kind of, this is of course a very summarized version and reduced my arguments to its bones and its sheer skeleton. But that was to try and give you an idea of what are the choices open to women. And these choices always have three parameters, which are the amount of income, the amount of work in terms of hours, and something which cannot be quantified, which is independence, but which also has degrees. Because to reduce their total workload in terms of hours, women must give up paid work, and therefore independence. On the other hand, to gain some independence without compromising their living standards, they must assume a double workday. By that I mean that a woman on her own wages is not going to have a very high living standard, so she must marry or live with a man. And that means that she must perform domestic work and have a double workday. Now, if they choose to live alone on their wages, plus the social security benefits that the European welfare states have given and are now slowly taking back, that could be called the choice of independence. But it implies a drastic lowering of living standards. And those who make it, who unwed mothers or divorced women, have a very low income, and when they have children, they must do also a good deal of housework. So, this is roughly the choices that are open to women in France. That is, they can increase their level of independence only by either renouncing being well off economically, or by agreeing to a very, very heavy workload, and they can have, let's say, comfortable living standards only by renouncing part of independence, etc., etc. It will always move between these three parameters, and what you gain on one of the parameters, you lose on the other. So, on what has been towards this, the action of recent French governments, whatever their denomination, be they conservative or socialist, has been remarkably consistent, which should be a lesson to all of us to not necessarily trust the tax that parties or governments give themselves. In the last 20 years, whether the governments were conservative or socialist, they all supported part-time work and also family policies that sought to discourage women from entering and remaining in the labor market. For example, in 1985, there was a measure called the Parental Education Allowance, which means getting something like a minimum wage for 2 years for raising your kid, which is supposedly gender neutral, but in fact was geared towards women and was taken only by women, among other things, because no man would accept that kind of money as a real wage. It's a leave, therefore it's a paid leave, which you can take for 2 years after the birth of a child, and which normally guarantees you that you can go back to your work. But in fact, over the last, since that measure had been created, 500,000 women, of those who have taken it, have not found back their jobs. So this must be understood also as an employment policy that is as a preference of the state for keeping employment for males and trying to get women out of the labor market in times of unemployment. The law on equal pay, on occupational equality, which was passed in '83, when it was voted, had no teeth, that it was not enforceable and has never been enforced. And, there are many other things one could say, but the action of different French governments since '83 is in general in perfect contradiction, not only with the European directives, but also with the numerous international conventions that have been ratified by France, the most important of which is, of course, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, which was adopted by the UN in '79 and ratified by France in '83. Also on the ideological level, we've seen the magic word conciliation, meaning conciliation between work and family, come back to the front of the stage, and that conciliation is not something that is aimed at all the family members, that is equally aimed at fathers and mothers, or equally aimed at men and women. It is a word that is strictly, that is totally gendered and strictly reserved for women. That is, it is women's task to conciliate work and family. So, I studied very carefully the French report to the United Nations, which they had to produce for the Beijing conference, and which was published in '94. And the states' plans at that period, they may have evolved since, were very clear. It was the word family conciliation for women, the encouragement towards part-time work, again for women only, or for abandoning the labor market altogether, and the symbolic revalorization of family or volunteer work, And I think the government was right by equating volunteer work with family work, because both are done for free. So, of course, there were more things I wanted to tell you, and that was what has been the policy of the feminist movement vis-à-vis these developments, and also what tradition keeps the ideal of the housewife alive and kicking, and makes it into a reality. But I'm afraid there's no time for this. And I hope that this will be basis enough for an interesting discussion. Thank you very much.